The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
With your long-forgotten name, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
In the words of the unspeakable language, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
By the spilt blood of the wicked, who walk upon this world, sprouting the words of false idols, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
On the land of the dead harvest, that which brings the earth itself into your service, Yamal, we call upon you.
We call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you.
Yamal calls upon you.
The Sprouting, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast by Blighthouse Studio. Find us on your podcatcher of choice.
Hello, welcome to Vulgar History, feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is Margaret Tudor Part 2, but this is also the second episode of Season 6. There's something about Mary, Queen of Scots. If you're listening to this episode, I recommend listening to Margaret Tudor Part 1 first, just to understand a lot of what's going on. But if you just like to jump in, I respect that. And here we go. So we left things off. So Margaret had been married to the King of Scotland. She had 2 surviving sons, baby King James, baby Prince Alexander. He died, her husband. And then she, like some of the characters that you might remember. So there's the Duke of Albany, who became the regent for baby King James, but Margaret had fallen and super secret sexy married Archibald Douglas. And then she ran off with her babies and Archibald to Stirling Castle. Her brother Henry VIII was like, why don't you come to England? And she was like, I'd love to, but I can't, because if I do, then maybe baby King James won't be king anymore. And that's kind of where everything is at the moment. So meanwhile, back in Scotland, so the Duke of Albany, who was the regent for baby King James, he was John Stuart, some sort of descendant of one of the kings of Scotland. He had one main priority, and his priority was, understandable as the regent, was to get the baby king back from Margaret, because it's hard to be the regent for a baby king when the baby king is being actively held hostage by his mother, in a different country. So that was his goal. Margaret's main priority was just to keep the baby king and her other son the fuck away from the asshole Scottish lords. And so she kept her babies with her as long as she could, until she was finally out of options, and she unfortunately had to hand the 2 boys over to Albany and the asshole Scottish lords. Bear in mind that Margaret was now pregnant again with her first child, with Archibald. And so this child, like, spoiler, is going to be Margaret Douglas, who we talked about in the Women Trapped in Towers season. So after this, or before you listen to this podcast, you can listen to the Margaret Douglas story to get kind of what her take on all of this situation was, but she's not born yet. Anyway, that's also if you have the vulgar history bingo card, naming your daughter after yourself moment. Anyway, so Margaret Tudor, pregnant with Archibald, and she was like, you know what? Okay, like, a la Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus, like, let's just be like the nativity and like head out on horses to Edinburgh for some, nesting time with my new young baby. That's what she wanted everybody to think she was doing. But in fact, she'd secretly contacted her brother Henry VIII and accepted his offer of safety in England. So her plan was to run away to join him there, basically just to get away from the asshole Scottish lords, which this would mean abandoning her two previous children. But like, were they going to murder her? She didn't know what was going on. Anyway, because patriarchy was a thing and is always getting in the way, she had to get permission from Albany and the asshole Scottish lords to travel anywhere. And so she was like, no big deal. I'm just going to take my little family to this random little Scottish town that's kind of close to the English border. But, I'm totally not going to go to England. I'm going to stay in Scotland. And the lords were like, sure, yeah, okay. And so she got off on this town. I'm sorry, I didn't write down what town it is. And then she just hopped over the border and got herself into safety in England. So she got one past Albany and the asshole Scottish lords, although their main thing was they just wanted baby King James, who they still had. Anyway, so now she's in England. So her brother Henry VIII set Margaret up in her own private castle, which is where she gave birth to her daughter, Margaret Douglas. Again, I did a whole episode about her a couple seasons ago. And around the same time of having this baby and, not dying in childbirth, she got information that back up in Scotland, her younger son, baby Prince Alexander, had died. And just as though things couldn't get depressing enough for her at this point in time, is that she had begun to discover that her husband, Archibald, was, in fact, the worst. If you don't know how much he is the worst, he was one of the first people I ever profiled on Patreon in the So This Asshole series. He's awful. And when you know who his descendant is, that tracks. I mean, so Archibald and Margaret, their daughter was Margaret Douglas. As I discussed in the Margaret Douglas episode, Margaret Douglas's son is Lord Darnley, who later ends up married to Mary Queen of Scots. So this is just kind of where the asshole genes come from. Archibald and Darnley have a lot in common, just vis-a-vis being the worst. And it's not like Archibald did much to try to disguise the fact that he was the worst. So not only did he flee their English castle to return to Scotland after they had just snuck over there, but once he got back to Scotland, he made a deal with Albany and the asshole Scottish lords. Henry VIII, who already just like really hated Scottish people in general, he heard that Archibald had done this, and he said, done like a Scot, which was, like a burn for him in that time. So anyway, so now Margaret is just kind of abandoned by her second husband, who betrayed her, separated from her only surviving son. She's got her baby, Margaret Douglas, there with her, or at least she's in England, I guess, silver lining. And Henry VIII was happy to have her back in town. He got her set up in Scotland Yard, which made me pause. But that was a castle at that time, before it was like police headquarters. Kind of like in the Queen Margot story for a while, she's like kept prisoner in the Louvre, and I'm like, the museum with the Mona Lisa? No, that was a castle before it was a museum. Anyway, so Margaret's living in Scotland Yard and just kind of spent some time doing some self-care. I think just kind of like processing everything that's just happened to her and of what we know of her interests and the things that spark joy in her. I would imagine she was designing some new outfits, thinking about jewels and how she could make some more jewelry, dancing, playing music, and maybe spending some time with her daughter, Lady Margaret. After about a year like this of just kind of like self-care vibes, kind of like in, when Hortense Mancini hung out in that guy's house for a while and she just got to just like vibe and like go walk in nature. Like this was just a good season for Margaret, just to kind of be with herself. Anyway, so after about a year, a new treaty of reconciliation had been signed between England and Scotland. Like, listeners from England and Scotland, like, am I correct in that England and Scotland have forever been just on off at war? Is that true? Like, it seems like it's so chaotic. Anyway, you never hear about Wales doing stuff like this. What's that relationship like? Welsh listeners, let me know. Anyway, so there had been this peace treaty, and so Margaret was like, okay, like, I want to go back to Scotland, and I want to, like, I'm going to bring baby Margaret with me, and I want to reunite with my terrible husband, and also to see my son, little boy, King James. But the asshole Scottish lords were just like, we're not going to let you visit the king, a child who you, like, very recently kidnapped, literally. And Archibald greeted her just kind of like, oh, hey, how's it going? Like, this is my mistress. I'm living with her now. I've been also spending all your money without telling you. So she went back and things were not at all clearly what she had wanted. Margaret maybe herself puts it best. She wrote Henry a letter, and this is a quote from that letter. This is about Archibald. She wrote, quote, I am so minded that, and I may by law of God and to my honor to part with him, for I wit well he loves me not, as he shows me daily. Like, he loves me not, as he shows me daily is so devastating. Like, Archibald was just done with her. He just had no interest in even pretending to not be cruel. So basically, what she was writing this letter to Henry was to say, like, she kind of wanted to divorce Archibald's useless ass, and who can blame her? But someone did blame her, and that was Henry VIII, because this was all happening years before the whole Anne Boleyn situation and when Henry VIII suddenly became cool with divorce. So at this point, Henry VIII was just the English king, and he was really religious, and he was morally opposed to divorce. Full stop. But not just that. It turns out that Archibald could be a handy ally to have around to help offset the pro-French Scottish faction, who were also of concern to Henry and to England. Because I've been talking a lot about England and Scotland, but the other big player if we're setting the scene for Mary Queen of Scots, is France. Like, France is going to have a big involvement in this story. Anyway, so Margaret is just like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, Henry VIII is just like siding with Archibald instead of his own sister, which actually, knowing their past, is like the most surprising thing in the story is maybe that brief period of time where Henry actually did side with Margaret. Anyway, so Margaret is just like, she did that whole thing of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend scenario, which we've seen happen only a couple of times previously in this podcast. We saw it happen with Margaret of Anjour when she teamed up with Warwick. We saw it, Rani Didda did a similar thing, and Margaret is doing the same thing because she decided to ally herself with the asshole Scottish lords led by Albany, because that was her best and only option. Like, how desperate do you have to be to side with them? Anyway, so at this point, I'm not sure who the regent is of baby King James. I guess it's still Albany, but Albany himself was like actively in France, just kind of like regent from afar, I guess. And he didn't feel like heading back to Scotland, which at this point, all love to Scottish listeners listening to this now. But a lot of what I've read about this era of Scotland, like the 1500s, is that it was kind of cold. It's kind of like in the Christina of Sweden story when Descartes was just like, please don't make me go to Sweden. Just kind of like, if you could live in France, just like in a castle, but like with fires and wine and cheese, versus living in Scotland where it's just kind of like everyone's wearing fur all the time and it's cold and kind of damp. Like, Albany was like, I'm going to stay in France. Thank you so much. But he was like, you know what? Like, if you want so bad, Margaret, you can just be the regent again if you want. IDK. But then things get even more confusing because we are introduced to another man in Margaret's life, who is James Hamilton, the Earl of Arran. Hamilton, oh my gosh, like, this is a women's history podcast, and this is a Margaret Tudor podcast, and all these men are just bitches. They're just like, they all have a nemesis with each other. Like, they're just so busy trying to like have a dick measuring contest with each other. I can't stand any of them. But this guy, Hamilton. So he was the arch nemesis of Archibald. And so Margaret was just like, great. She's just like siding like the enemy of my enemy. she's just like, okay, I'm going to be friends with this guy who her like horrible husband already hates, to just kind of like play mind games to sort of like pit them against each other. So she was just kind of like using all the skills that she learned. I don't know if she learned these sorts of skills from Margaret Beaufort, but she learned these skills from somewhere, or maybe she just like was amazing on her own. So she just played mind games, like siding with one, then siding with the other. And this went on for like 3 years, where she's just like trying to break Archibald down emotionally by siding with his enemies. Finally, things were just getting so crazy that Albany was like, okay, fine, I'll like stop eating wine and cheese in France. And he dragged his ass back over to Scotland to try and like play mediator in the situation. So it's 1521. Margaret is now 32 years old. She and Albany, warmly greet each other like, hey, how are you? Whatever. Like, we're friends now. We were enemies, but now we're friends. We both like wine. Like, it's cool. And everyone is just like, wait, weren't those two enemies recently? And then everybody is just like, oh my God, are these two having an affair? Herman, my pills. But there was not then, and there still is not now, any evidence that these two were having an affair. Knowing Margaret, like I feel I do, she might have just sort of like pretended they were having an affair just to fuck with people's minds, because she was just getting really tired of all this Scottish lord bullshit. Albany was also good friends with the Pope, whoever the Pope was at this time. And so she knew that siding with him, like maybe Albany could put in a good word with the Pope, which would help her be able to divorce Archibald. And so maybe that was another benefit of this friendship. So as a team, Margaret and Albany like work together to just kind of like get everything going again, just to like get the asshole lords off their asses and to stop just being little bitches. And eventually Margaret was just like, you know what? I can take it from here. Like, Albany, you can leave if you want. And Albany's like, thank God. Thank you. I miss cheese and wine. And he headed back to France. And the minute he left, Margaret staged a full-on coup to seize power for herself and for her son. Like, I love that she made it seem like she's such a chaotic person, and she would sort of like give rumors of what she was doing, but secretly she's doing something even cooler. And it's a bit like this show I've been watching lately called Columbo, which is a very old murder mystery show. But the detective Columbo always pretends like he's really like foolish and doesn't know what he's doing, but then he actually is the smartest person in the room. So like, mark that off in your bingo card if it's on there. A coup. So at this point, her son James is like, I don't know, he's a tween. Basically, he'd been living away from royal court, and Margaret had him brought back. And then she struck a new law stating that James didn't need to have a regent at all anymore and could now rule on his own as king. So he's 12 years old, meaning that, like, even though he didn't need a regent legally, like, he still kind of needed an adult on the scene. And this is how Margaret Tudor got herself formally recognized as the king's chief counselor. Like, the way she just played all these lords against each other, like playing the long game for years, like just using them and discarding them, all with the long game of just getting herself back in power. Like, it's breathtaking. It's like, when we get to scoring, the scheminess of this is I think she's gonna get a good scheminess points. So here we are. Margaret and her son are now in charge of Scotland. Her brother Henry VIII still in charge of England. And so the whole thing was still happening. Henry wanted to take over Scotland. And, he'd always kind of hated his sister Margaret. So this is just really taking their sibling rivalry on to like an international war-based scale. So would you be surprised to hear that the next twist in the story is that Henry teamed up with Archibald to try and bring down Margaret? Like, honestly, it just really proves a theory I have, which is that there's no situation that Henry VIII's involvement did not make worse. And the thing is, as like politically savvy and clever and playing the long game as Margaret was, she also had what we're going to see a couple more times, and we have seen previously in her family, the Tudors, is just kind of like not great taste in husbands is a thing that keeps happening. It's kind of in the, the Empress Sisi and her cousin Ludwig and stuff, where it's just like the Wittelsbachs, like, oh, they're sort of prone to like melancholy and like some like mental illness. It's like the Tudor people are just tend to fall in love with the exact wrong person, and it fucks up everything. So just when things are going well, here's what happens. And honestly, like Henry VIII has this in common with her too. So it's not just the women Tudors, it's like the men Tudors as well. Like just kind of diving headfirst into love affairs that led their entire countries to turn into just kind of like collateral in like them just having a crush. So anyway, Margaret fell deeply in love with a guy named Henry Stuart, which is like everyone has the last name Stuart in this story because that's the last name of the Scottish kings and they fucked all the time and had lots of illegitimate children. So anyway, Henry Stuart. So Margaret is still technically married to Archibald. I do not blame her whatsoever for seeking companionship elsewhere, but her crush on Henry Stuart manifested in her appointing him into a senior position that he wasn't qualified to do, which is kind of like another Tudor woman whose name was Elizabeth I, who had all of her, the way that she treated Robert Dudley and then Robert Devereux, like she gave them positions that maybe they shouldn't have had just because she kind of had a crush on them. Anyway, like the Tudor human beings, just like all genders of Tudors, just like make the same mistakes over and over. And it's fascinating and not unlike in the Sweet Valley sagas, which if you haven't read them or if you haven't listened to Double Love, my favorite podcast, the Sweet Valley sagas are about the people from Sweet Valley High, and it's like their ancestors, and like every generation there's like twins, and one is kind of mischievous and one is really like saintly, and then one betrays the other, and it's just like the same thing keeps happening, and it's just that again here anyway. And the asshole Scottish lords are just there lurking, you know, and they're probably mad about how she played them earlier, and they're always looking for any excuse to turn on Margaret because they hated smart women in power positions. They saw this as an opportunity to remove her from power. And so now they, the asshole Scottish lords, team up with Archibald to take down Margaret. And this is where I feel like you need one of those drawings like they have in football of just kind of like, you know, a circle with an arrow where it's like, now these two are teamed up and now these two are like every possible combination of people has happened now, except for Margaret teaming up with Archibald. And I'm fairly confident that's never going to happen. So what happened next? Archibald marched to Edinburgh with a bunch of allies and demanded to be let into Parliament. While he was en route, Margaret was busy throwing a party because that's just who she is, and she refused to let her useless, estranged husband ruin her plans to dance the night away. She likes dancing, she likes music, she likes dresses, she likes jewels, and even if her life is like a disaster, like she is going to do her, and I respect that. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. She heard this was happening. She's just like, oh, this guy ruining my party. So she ordered cannons to be aimed and shot at him from 2 different castles. Like, if there had been a 3rd castle nearby, she probably would have ordered cannons from there as well, but there was just 2. Anyway, so 2 English ambassadors were at the party, and they were like, maybe don't fire cannons from 2 directions at your husband. And then she said, and this is a direct quote, go home and not meddle with Scottish matters. This is me talking again. Just to clarify, because like in Scotland, guess what they do? They settle their like fraught divorce situations with cannons. And if you have a problem with that, then they'll point their cannons at you. Like this is just like what Scotland is about, apparently. Archibald wasn't feeling like being hit by cannons, so he and his troops withdrew before she actually fired the cannons at him. So she'd won that night, but not the battle, because the asshole lords were just kind of like whining and being like, maybe you should give Archibald a second chance. Like, oh my God, these guys, they're in like every story we're going to be doing this season, and I just hate them so fucking much. Just to shut them up, she finally allowed Archibald back on the scene in February 1525. Did Archibald behave politely and appreciatively towards his wife and his stepson, the king, for being so forgiving of him? Like, of course he did not. He is the worst. And this story is just constant kidnapping. What Archibald did was he kidnapped King James, now a teenager, and refused to give him back for 3 years, during which time Archibald made everyone treat him, Archibald, as the regent, even though he was just the king's stepfather. Understandably, King James emerged from this nightmare, like this 3-year imprisonment by his deadbeat stepfather, with a lifelong hatred of England, because Archibald had the backing of Henry VIII to do this whole situation. And he also emerged with a hatred of the Douglas family, which is Archibald's family. And just a reminder, like this King James who's seen here, this isn't the King James who later marries Anne of Denmark. This James is the father of Mary, Queen of Scots. They're all called James, so it's confusing, but this is a different James. Anyway, so I mean, yet another red flag about her husband being the worst in the world. Margaret's desire to divorce him just like could not have been higher. Despite everything, she and Albany were still on good terms. At this point, I'm just like, Albany, I don't know. I like their vibe. I don't think they were lovers, but I think that he seems like, in the context of this story, maybe like the coolest person other than Margaret. So, and remember, Albany was also friends with the Pope. So she got him to continue to like promote her cause with the Pope and like the Catholic authorities in Rome. And finally, in March of 1527, she was granted her petition of divorce. But because this was oldie times and there wasn't text messaging, there wasn't email, there wasn't overnight delivery, just basically, and everyone was at war with everybody else. And so like this messenger, like her divorce was permitted in March, but she didn't find out until December, which is just 9 months of her not knowing. And that is really frustrating to me. Anyway, she got the news, and then what did she do except marry goddamn Henry Stuart? Her brother, Henry VIII, was just like, oh my God, Margaret, you can't get divorced. Marriage is like a holy thing. It's meant for life. And she's just like, oh, we'll see if your mood changes about that in a couple of years when you meet Anne Boleyn. Anyway, so all of this, the whole like Henry VIII worked with Archibald to kidnap teen King James, the fact that Margaret got divorced when Henry didn't approve of that, like this is why the 2 of them just like fully estranged. And this is why later on, when Henry VIII was making his will or whatever about like who would inherit the throne of England, because I have to assume So, but to recap, Henry VIII had 3 surviving children. So there was Edward, who was like a little sickly boy who died very young. And there was Mary, who became Mary I, and then Elizabeth, who became Elizabeth I. And if there had been a boy anywhere in the family tree, that person would have taken over after Edward. Like that's, again, like you can listen to some of the Lady Jane Grey season to get more about that. There was a guy called Ferdinando. So one might think Henry would be like, okay, like who's going to be my heir? It has to be a boy. Like, oh, Margaret has a son who's called James, who's a king of Scotland. Like maybe that person could be my heir. But no, because he hates Scotland. He hates Margaret because she got divorced and because he was pals with Archibald and Archibald was her ex. He hated Margaret's Scottish children. And so it's this is why. Like Henry just hated that. He just like chopped off that whole branch of the family tree effectively. And so this is why we wound up with the whole Lady Jane Grey scenario, because he didn't consider Margaret's children to be possible new monarchs. And this really leads to Mary Queen of Scots' life being like what it was, with just like England versus Scotland, but also with Mary Queen of Scots kind of thinking like, shouldn't I be Queen of England? And like not insubstantial amount of people being like, shouldn't Mary Queen of Scots be Queen of England? But they weren't allowed to be because Henry VIII hated Margaret, and this is why. Anyway, so all of which to say, Henry VIII is yet again patient zero for generally a lot of misery in a lot of people's lives, especially a lot of women's lives, and that is part of why I hate him a lot. But he did bring the drama, and that's not the end of the story. So June 1528, teen King James V finally escaped from his horrible stepfather Archibald, and he claimed full power of being king all for himself. He's like, I don't need a regent, I don't need an adult, I don't need my mother, like I'm the king, fuck everybody. And like in terms of just like the complex trauma he must have had from all this kidnapping, it's just like good for him. Just like take control, fuck everybody, yes. So he sent Archibald into exile, which is frankly where he belonged. I hope he never comes back. He also... So her mother's new husband was Henry Stuart, and James gave him the title of Lord Methven. So presumably he liked him better than her mother's previous partner. So even though he was a king all by himself, Margaret continued to advise him, which is again sort of the vibes of like her grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, of being not the monarch, but actually just a valuable advisor. And that's the thing, like a lot of history until recently-ish has been like, oh, Margaret Tudor, she just like dresses and dancing. Like she wasn't smart or anything. Or it's like, no, she was like a powerhouse and also really smart and also advised her son. So just like you can do that and also like dresses, people can have layers. Her main cause, like her main political thing that she was encouraging him about was to try to get peace between England and Scotland, which seems insurmountable, but it was her life's work. So in 1534, perhaps because of her influence, a new peace agreement between England and Scotland was created. Do you remember last time there was it was when her marriage was arranged to the previous King James. There was a treaty of like perpetual peace. And I was like, that doesn't last. You see how it didn't last? Anyway, so the thing with this peace agreement is that James was still just like, he hated England. He hated English people. He hated Henry VIII because of Henry VIII's connection to the whole being kidnapped by Archibald for 3 years situation. Henry VIII, frankly, like he always has, just hated Scottish people. He just hated Scotland and he hated Scottish people. That's just what he was like. He also especially hated his sister. And so Margaret was just like, oh my God, like how is she going to like get these two people, like her son and her brother, who are the kings of England and Scotland, unfortunately, to like have peace meetings when they just like hate each other so like to the bone. She used every ounce of skill and cleverness she had to try and convince the two kings to meet each other face to face to solidify this new peace agreement. But everybody's least favorite supporting characters in this saga, the asshole Scottish lords, sabotaged her intentionally, and also just like the constant infighting and uselessness got in the way, and everything just got so complicated and messy that these two men never actually met face to face. And by now, Margaret, and I give her all the credit for this, like she had spent most of her adult life trying to make peace between these two countries, was just like, peace out. Like she had just run out of fucks to give. She was just like, fuck you and fuck you. Like I choose me. Like fuck all of this. I'm out. She told an advisor in a private conversation that she was weary of Scotland. And she just started like telling Henry VIII Scottish state secrets because she just didn't give a fuck about Scotland or politics or anything anymore. And it's just like fair play. Like she had like, after all this, like, of course, it's just like, of course. But also adding perhaps to this sort of like gives no fucks attitude was the fact that she had realized that her new husband was also a terrible person because, surprise, Henry Stuart sucked. So like her previous ex-husband Archibald, Henry Stuart's main hobby seemed to be spending Margaret's money without asking her for money and hooking up with other women. And so Margaret was like, well, you know, the Pope let me get one divorce. What's one more? But this time, someone new was standing in the way of her getting a divorce, and that was her son, King James, now an adult. But remember how James had like given that title to Henry Stuart to show that he maybe kind of liked him? So it seems like perhaps, allegedly, James was being bribed by his new stepfather, Henry Stuart, but probably with Margaret's money, to act against Margaret. And so James refused to allow her to get a divorce, like his own mother. Margaret tried her old trick of running away to England, but she was intercepted at the border and sent back to Edinburgh. She was trapped in Scotland. She was trapped in this shitty marriage, and that's it. And then her son James took a bride, who we're going to hear about in a future episode. So, and this bride was a cool person, and they became friends. So her daughter-in-law was Marie de Guise, who was from France. She was like 6 feet tall, and like I'm going to do at least 2 episodes about her coming up soon. Anyway, Marie, like you just need to know that these 2 women quickly realized they were the 2 smartest and most capable people in all of Scotland. And they agreed to help each other out and to be friends, like women supporting women. You gotta love it. So they were just like pals. This was cool. Like Marie could be sort of like her protege in some ways, but then Margaret, 3 years into the relationship, had a stroke. As her condition worsened, she called for her son to come and visit her, but he didn't because he was, turns out, also the worst. It became clear that she wasn't going to get better, and Margaret had not written a will, but she made a request that her possessions be given to her daughter. Remember her daughter from the previous episode, Lady Margaret Douglas. Margaret Tudor passed away October 18th, 1541 at age 51. And when her son finally showed up to be like, to mourn her or whatever, he ignored her request to give the possessions to his half-sister, Lady Margaret Douglas, and instead kept everything for himself. And you can learn more about that in the Lady Margaret Douglas episode I did a few seasons ago. Every man in the story is awful except for Albany. And maybe he was awful too, but maybe not. Anyway, so despite Henry VIII's hatred of Scotland and his sister and excluding them from the line of succession, eventually what happened is just like so many Tudors died off that when they're looking for a new heir, they wound up having to look at the descendants of Margaret. And that's what we're going to be spending the whole season talking about some more. So on this podcast, if this is your first time hearing the conclusion of a story on the podcast, we score everybody on, first, no, there's 2 categories. So first there is the, if anyone in the story was like a cool person who helped out, they can be awarded the Lady Jane Seymour Memorial Award for Outstanding Supporting Performance. This is named in honor of Lady Jane Seymour, who was best friend goals. She was the best friend of Lady Catherine Grey. Albany was there. You know what? I don't think there's going to be a lot of people receiving this award this season. So I'm going to give it to Albany because he helped Margaret get her divorce. He let her be regent. And then when she did a coup, he was like, okay, and didn't intervene. And in a world where every man was terrible, he was okay. But then we also score everybody on the Fredegund Memorial Scandiliciousness scale. And that is named after Fredegund, a queen of ancient France who was so great in so many categories that we remember her when we score everybody else. So the first category is scandiliciousness. And this is looking at not just like to us today, or like to me, because again, this podcast is biased with an agenda, how scandalous were her actions seen by the people of her time. Now, in terms of like, yes, she repeatedly kidnapped her own children, who included the king. But then like the asshole lords also kidnapped the king. Archibald kidnapped the king. Like, so I don't think that's scandalous to that era because everyone was doing it. What I do think was scandalous was the divorcing, because that was, it made Henry VIII clutch his pearls, Herman my pills. It made people sort of shocked. Scandalous also, she did a coup. She outsmarted everybody and took over. Like, it's not a 10 for scandaliciousness, but it's certainly up there. I think I'm going to give her for scandaliciousness, I'm going to say 7.5, because while some of these things are certainly scandalous, it's like, yes, she did a coup. Yes, she pointed cannons at her ex-husband, but it's kind of like everyone else was acting like that also. But the divorce, that was shocking to people. Her scheminess, this is where I think she's going to get top marks. I'm literally giving her a 10 for scheminess, because the long game, the way that she played all the asshole lords against each other until she suddenly was in the power position, and they were just going to be like, wait, how did that even, like, her scheminess was top notch. And I do think that's something that her granddaughter, Mary Queen of Scots, inherited from her. Her significance. So this is, like, she was the mother of James. She was involved in like numerous attempted peace treaties between England and Scotland. It's because of her actions, like specifically the divorcing and stuff, that made Henry VIII cut her out of his will. And if that hadn't happened, then maybe the succession would have been different in England if they had gone to her descendants. So that is significant, because things could have turned out differently with, maybe there wouldn't have been Mary I, maybe there would have been Elizabeth I, that would have been. So it's kind of like a butterfly effect, though. Like, I think her actions certainly were significant at the time, although England and Scotland, I think, would have gone back and forward, warring even without her. I'm going to say a 7 for significance. The sexism bonus, and this is kind of, like, I was keeping that in mind when I was telling the story. Like, the fact that James wouldn't let her get a divorce because he had sided with his stepfather, that sucks. And that was like partially a religious thing, but partially also just like a boys' club thing. Like, she was constrained in many ways by like the asshole Scottish lords who just like wouldn't let her have power because she is a woman. Like, we're going to see like the culture of the asshole Scottish lords, and just like, I don't want to say like Scotland, because it was like where she was living in the royal court, like Edinburgh and stuff. Like, it's not the Highlander vibe of like, sexy Scots and kilts and just kind of like that vibe. Like, it's just like prissy people in a royal court who are all like, but did you fill out the paperwork? Like, that's the vibe. I think sexism certainly got in her way. She outsmarted them, which is to her credit. The sexism bonus is really a way to give points to people who could have done more were it not for the patriarchy. And she did do quite a bit despite the patriarchy. So I'm going to say for sexism, I'll give her a 7 as well. And so for the first score of season 6, what do we have? We have a 31.5. So 31.5 lands her on the scale. Let's see, other people with that same score. So Cecilia of Sweden has a 31.5. She was, I did a super special about her. I think she also had a similar combination of kind of like give no fucks attitude, and also just kind of like having it here for a good time, not a long time. Agrippina from ancient Rome has a 31. Sophia Dorothea of Celle has a 31. Elizabeth Woodville, who's Margaret's grandmother, has a 31. So that's where she lands. Not in the top 10, but certainly anything 30 and above is notable on the scale, I would say. And yeah. So I do want to mention some things to you, as I do at the end of every podcast, because this is where I can just like let you know some info. So first of all, if you want to reach out to me about this story, or about Mary Queen of Scots, or this season, or if you have a suggestion of somebody else you want to hear, you think would be good on this podcast, like, you can reach out. There's a form at vulgarhistory.com where you can leave me messages. You can also email me directly at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I'm also on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod, where you can send me messages, but also see all the things I'm posting there. And I'm also on TikTok at vulgarhistory. And if you want to support the podcast, I have a store, which is you can get your merch at vulgarhistory.store, where you can always use code TITSOUT for free US shipping or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. If you want to support the show via Patreon, so if you pledge at least $1 a month or more on Patreon, which you go to patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, you'll get early ad-free access to all the episodes and all past episodes too, with no ads. And for $5 a month, you get access to bonus episodes. So I mentioned that I did an episode of So This Asshole about Archibald Douglas. So that's, if you want to get more information about how he was the worst, that episode lives on Patreon. But yes, I do So This Asshole episodes, just talking about gross men from history, about once a month. And those episodes are between like 30 minutes to an hour. I also, around once a month, do episodes of Vulgar Piece Theater, where I talk about costume dramas with Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson, and those tend to be 3 hours long. We get into it. Our most recent episode that we've just done is Lady Jane, the movie starring Helena Bonham Carter. Coming up soon, we're going to be discussing Corsage, the Empress Sisi movie, and Chevalier, the upcoming movie about the Chevalier St. George, which are movies you should watch. You should look for them and watch them because they look interesting and good. I think that's everything. And again, I'm just really excited to be diving into this new season with you. Next week is, I think, going to be a super special episode where we're going to be, just to give me a bit more time to research for the next Mary Queen of Scots theme show. And there's lots to look forward to. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors, including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.